It's not so much about allowing or not allowing people to connect. It is a matter of providing a structure that enables connections. So people are going to connect anyway, but the structure is like, it's like the lines on a tennis court. Some people feel a bit constrained about them, but having a structured dialogue helps you to connect. And the connection is always pairwise. You always take one object, one identified, observed example of what is valuable. And rather than focusing on that object and building a mountain around it to defend its value, to promote its value, you accept it at its essence. It's valuable. You don't have to defend it. You have to explain it so we understand it, but you accept at its essence, it's valuable. So we don't have a great big landscape populated by volcanoes of value. We have individual value statements, and our interests are not in identifying a deeper and richer understanding of why something is valuable to one person from their perspective or to some people from their shared perspectives. The issue is, how do we connect something that is accepted as valuable with something else which is accepted as valuable? So this is the bridging that occurs, and it occurs through a relationship. All of our thinking begins with confusion at a certain level. Too much or too little confusion is disabling. But thinking begins with confusion, and as we think, we sense coherence. What is it that feels like it makes sense to us? And if we're comfortable with the process by which we've been thinking, we then feel confident. I'm going to come back to that later, because I want to tell you why voting can cripple the development of learning. Okay? So the notion of having these ideas and connecting them by relations, the structure that allows you to work consistently across a constellation of important ideas, is a unifying relation. And as it turns out, as a matter of pragmatism, but also of logic, the relationship of influence is generic enough, powerful enough, and appropriate enough to bring very different ideas together. The question is to ask, will idea A significantly help us realize idea B? Will implementing objective A significantly help us to implement objective B? Now, people who are advocates of objective A or B are likely to say, yeah, sure, because they want that thread to be there. But it's a question of feeling the coherence of that thread. So when we ask someone significantly, they get uncomfortable. They say, what are you talking about? And we say, well, you're thinking with your head. You have to do more than that. You have to also be thinking with your heart. Significantly is going to ask you, does it feel like a significant connection? And this is an area for important discussions, because people, once they realize that it's legitimate for them to say, oh, I can see the connection, I don't feel it, or I do feel this connection and this is why, then the notion of how that bridge becomes more than a thread, how it becomes a bridge strong enough to carry the weight of the group, is very important. Now, we only record instances where groups feel that there is a strong relationship. We don't punish anyone if they don't see it, and we don't require absolute agreement. We say, if we feel that this might be a strong relationship, then let's hold on to it for now. And let's move to some other comparisons. All right? So in this way, it doesn't matter where you start. We start with ideas that people think are important.
All right. This is essential artificial intelligence neural networking as applied to groups of people.
I don't have enough of a background of where you're coming from with that to know whether I could affirm it, but I don't reject it. I just it's a little out of my wheelhouse, because we don't consider what we're doing artificial intelligence because we are not injecting the content.
Right.
There's no content at all. And in fact, we divorce ourselves from ever expressing a content judgment.
Absolutely. That's very powerful. Completely powerful. It's just similar to training an AI entity to only accept positive reinforcement.
Very good. I didn't know that. I like that. I don't know what I can do with it yet, but I'm going to keep my eyes open for it.
Yes.
Okay.
This goes into my dad's invention, his social networking invention, because he foresaw bridging the connections between people of shared values using an artificial intelligence system that would just, rather than filter out people exclusively, it would also find the complement and just strengthen those bridges between people.
Well, what we find that might be interesting in that context is that as people are talking about the relationships of A to B,
yeah,
they have their mental models for how the world works.
Right.
Those mental models collapse like a house of cards, causing massive showers of humor as people realize how wrong they were.
Uh-huh.
Without having that conversation, with only having their decisions as to whether the influence is strong, they would never learn.
Right.
So it turns out that the learning process is a process not of holding on to your initial expressions of understanding, but to remain open. And as it turns out, there's an interesting group at Brown University that has studied whether or not people intensify their beliefs or soften their beliefs.
Uh-huh.
And the critical question to intensify someone's belief is to ask them why they believe. Because that forces them to defend their values. But if you ask them, how will the action that you are proposing, which is based on your belief, work in the world? Then they're challenged with the implementation issue of their position.
Right.
Moves them back up to their interests. It's a mediation process. But we find that in this pairwise comparison, this bridge building,
yes,
that's where the rich learning occurs. And I say rich learning because I believe you only hear sincere laughter in a group when somebody is learning something. I mean compassionate and shared laughter, not ridicule, but the sincere, loving laughter of saying, gee, did I get that backwards? And when people realize that they're in that type of a sporting event, they want to play. And they do crawl out on the limb. And they will say, well, I'm not entirely sure, but I think I see this. And because they're not being criticized, someone else is saying, okay, I can see that. What else do we have for ideas? And people do reverse the way they think. They learn. This is a way to get through a log jam. Now, we've created a culture that is a just do it culture. We've created a culture that likes debate. The idea of debate is to destroy your adversary, not to learn from them.
Different from dialogue.
Different from dialogue. But I will say that I'm talking about a very specific dialogue, which is a design dialogue. Because there are dialogues which are expository,
yes,
and that's when we speak from our mental models.
Right.
There are dialogues which are reflective, and that's when we explain how our mental models give rise to our thoughts. And then there are dialogues which are design dialogues. And that is where we begin to go into the process of rethinking the way we've been thinking. And that third form of dialogue is not really even on the radar screen of the National Coalition of Dialogue and Deliberation. It's not easy. And that's part of the problem, because a lot of the interest in engaging a community is not to engage the community in its collective learning. It's often to engage them as an audience,
right,
um, or to score points for having engaged them as an audience. And those tend to be cathartic. People say, well, we talked about composting last month, so we're done. What should we talk about next month?
Right.
And you have the topic du jour, and eventually you have something called dialogue fatigue. Now, what we found is that with this process of the structured democratic dialogue or structured dialogic design, this design dialogue, is that people don't get fatigued from laughing as they're learning.
Yeah.
Actually, it energizes them.
Yes.
So if the opportunity can be extended on a regular basis, you will end up with the usual suspects. That is, people who like to come together, to laugh, to come together and have a feeling for what they're doing. But to keep the learning rich and relevant, you've always got to churn the mill and find people with different perspectives. Now, if you use a design dialogue and you find different perspectives, you have to do something with that information, because you'll have people calling you for 6 months like they were calling me and saying, what are we going to do? Where is it going to go? And since they're giving you of their time, you have an ethical obligation to them to do something a little bit more with their thinking than leaving it on a shelf like a master plan.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where I am. I think that what we need are citizen think tanks. And what we need is an arena for hanging the artistic artifacts that are generated by group thinking. Now, if you want, I can go into that a little bit, because the parallel between the neurological mind creating and holding memories in webs of neuronal connections has a parallel with the group mind creating collections of artifacts.
Yeah.
And those artifacts, if they're constructed appropriately, they first of all will catalog what are the observations that have value. Then they will create a taxonomy that relates those different variables into classes of similar concerns to reduce the total complexity of working with 100, 200 ideas.
Yeah.
And then you're going to connect them together. So you need to begin to ask the question of, does A influence B? And that has to be recorded. If you do that, the end result is a tree. Now this was the breakthrough that Christakis was involved with John Warfield. John Warfield was a 15-year-old mathematical prodigy who was not blessed with the personality to match his genius. But he was able to use set theory very profoundly, and to realize that transitive relationships like significantly influence or even aggravate have an A to B, B to C, A to C type of relationship. And he realized that if you populate a matrix based upon a certain type of inquiry question, that matrix can be reduced to a tree, like root cause analysis. If you're familiar with that problem-solving method in engineering or business, people will want to tunnel down and to see, well, how did we get into the problem we got into? So they start from a situation and they try to back it up and back it up and back it up. And to the end of the day, they have a tree where they've been able to dig down to the root and to say, well, I think the root cause is we're not communicating with each other. And that cascades through their operational systems and wreaks havoc at a certain level. This systems view allows people to look at the way they've been thinking and to say, looking at the artifact, yeah, this is a fair representation of what we have talked about today. That means that they have a sense of coherence at that point of the overall meaning that they have discovered. And with that meaning, they also realize that there are some high leverage ideas at the bottom of their tree, which they did not consider important. Some people do. And if you vote on priorities, without structuring a system's view of priorities, then the things that come to your mind as being important are urgency, vocal loudness, intensity, authority. Those are all legitimate reasons, but none of them speaks to the issue of leverage.
Uh-huh.
So when you vote, the priorities tend to be erroneous from a systems perspective. They're the types of priorities that have you putting out fires but never preventing them,
Uh-huh.
having conversations but never moving beyond them. So when you ask what is my goal,
Yeah.
I want to cultivate this type of practice in an institution where young practitioners can learn it, use it, and apply it in the world.
Huh.
Now, it's also a way of telling someone, we've got a great way of thinking, but it involves a lobotomy. You must stop thinking the way you have been thinking.
Right.
Not everyone's willing to do that.
Yeah.
And
Gentlemen, I've got another